So let's start with the Bayesian brain. Bayesian inference is a statistical method for describing the probability of a particular hypothesis, event, or belief. Put simply, you have a particular hypothesis about the world, you take in new information, and then that new information either confirms or changes your previously held hypothesis. Some think of the brain as operating on a similar principle. Friston, in this interview, describes the brain as a sort of mini scientist, which takes in new data about the world and then uses that data to form beliefs about how the world works. So there are two processes here. A bottom-up process, using data from the eyes, the ears, pain and temperature sensations of the body, proprioception, and then a top-down mental model, which is constantly predicting what this new information is going to be. The top-down process also includes the ability to focus attention or ignore perceptual data that it deems unimportant. So this is a lot simpler than it sounds. Think of it as you're walking around most of the time wearing clothes. Most of us are. And your brain is receiving all sorts of information about the interaction between your skin and the fabric of your pants or your socks or your shoes. But most of the time, you're not thinking about anything like that. Your brain just comfortably ignores it because it's not important and you're focused on doing other things. Unless you're like my brother, in which case you have to be very particular about what types of socks you will wear and what shoes you will wear until, how old were you when you finally allowed yourself to wear jeans in middle school or something?
I was 27.
All right. So if you were unable to adjust any of the dials, all of this information was coming in and you couldn't turn things down and turn other things up, you'd probably be pretty disoriented and unable to focus. This ends up being a description of autism that Friston talks about during the interview. Finally, when your top-down process and your bottom-up process meet in the middle, sometimes there's a conflict when you were thinking you would see one thing and you saw something else. And the brain, given this conflict, can do one of two things. It can either adjust the previously held beliefs, or it can seek out more information in order to minimize this prediction error.
One of the hallmarks of schizophrenia is false beliefs about the world, including paranoia, delusions, and hallucinations. And Friston believes that understanding schizophrenia requires grasping how false beliefs interact with incoming sensory information. And this relates perfectly to the Bayesian brain that we were just discussing, specifically the interaction of the top-down and bottom-up processing, which occurs at the level of the synapse.
All right, the last thing we're going to talk about briefly is the free energy principle. It's basically a very complicated mathematical concept that I didn't really understand. But I did find a decent summary of it from a Scott Alexander piece from 2018, which I'm going to summarize now. Free energy is a mathematical concept that represents the minimization of prediction error. That is the difference between models and reality. The free energy principle is an attempt to unify perception, cognition, homeostasis, and action. Although they seem like very different activities, they all fall within the realm of free energy. And so life isn't doing four different things: perceiving, thinking, acting, and maintaining homeostasis. It's actually really just doing one thing, that is minimizing free energy in four different ways. So the brain tries to minimize its free energy by minimizing the difference between its models and reality. Sometimes it does that by updating its models of the world. Sometimes it does that by gathering more information or thinking more about the world. And other times it does this by changing the world to better match its models. I know that's very vague and not completely satisfying, but Friston does a good job of explaining how this relates to psychiatric and neurologic disease. And this is enough of an overview to get us through the episode.
So why does any of this matter? In the same way that physicists have aimed for a unified theory of physics that unites gravity, electromagnetism, the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force, Friston's free energy principle is an attempt to unify our understanding of numerous aspects of neuroscience and biology. Biology is messier than physics. So in some ways, this could even be considered a more ambitious effort. He's putting forward a unifying theory that not only explains physiologic states, but also pathophysiologic states like schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, Parkinson's. There's a lot in this episode. It's dense, but it's one of deep intellectual interest. And now we bring you Dr. Karl Friston.
All right. We are here with Dr. Karl Friston. Dr. Friston, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and maybe how you would describe yourself to someone who is unfamiliar with your work?
It really depends who I'm talking to, but let's assume I'm talking to a medical student. So I'm what's called an imaging neuroscientist. That's my day job, at least, which basically means that I spend most of my time doing research using the tool of brain imaging, specifically human brain mapping using various modalities. And that research agenda came out of a clinical training. So I'm also a qualified board certified, if you like, psychiatrist, but I haven't seen patients now for many, many decades. But I'm still a good citizen. I still see lots of students and worry about them in the same way that I imagine you will be worrying about your patients in the years to come.
Let's talk a little bit.
Communication in terms of the brain as an organ that updates its beliefs and tries to make sense of its world. So coming back to this notion of the brain as a little scientist making sense of the sensorium, but now understanding the functional architectures right down to the level of modulating, contextualizing, coordinating, message passing in hierarchical brain networks. Even further, right down to the level of the molecular biology and some of the more recent experiments that have been proposed to understand synaptopathies that underwrite, say, certain forms of childhood epilepsy, due to inborn errors in metabolism or possibly autoimmune mechanisms, really drilling down. And if you subscribe to the notion that the brain is an organ of inference, it's a statistical organ, that's a scientific organ, then you're just basically understanding the brain as complying with the basic principles that underwrite the scientific process. And as such, you are articulating brain function in terms of hypothesis testing and revising those hypotheses on the basis of data you've gone out there and very carefully selected, and at many time scales. So either on the time scale of several hundred milliseconds by deciding where to look next, what's going to be the most informative way to palpate this world, to acquire these data to resolve uncertainty about the scene that you're currently confronted with, right through to deciding which academic texts to read. All of this is you being a good scientist, knowing where to look for the right data, and then updating your beliefs about the way the world works or the way that your field of study operates, or indeed, how you work as a pro-social being. So all of that means that we are in the game of making inference and updating our beliefs, which means that a failure or an aberrance of that process manifest in, say, psychiatry and neuropsychology must at some level be articulated in terms of false inference. That notion that you need to have a theoretical framework that can gracefully accommodate the mechanics of the belief updating down to the level of synaptic message passing in brain, in the brain, right through to holding false beliefs of a persecutory or a depressive or a dysmorphophobic nature. You have to have that connection. So if you just think about most neurological and psychiatric syndromes, you can always rewrite them as some failure of inference. The poster child of this would be the false inferences that you and I might make if we made type 1 and type 2 statistical errors, basically inferring something is true when it's not, and vice versa. Those are beautiful metaphors for things like hallucinations and delusions. You're inferring something is there in the absence of any data or evidence when it's not there. Similarly, of course, you can make type 2 errors. You can infer something is not there when it is there. And you now have a sort of functionalist, or at least a mathematical, or at least a statistical account of agnosias, of neglect syndromes, that you can understand the structural pathology of, at the same time as being able to explain to yourself and the patient that this is a functional manifestation which can be construed as false inference. You can take this right through, I repeat, to dysmorphophobia and anorexia nervosa. You can even take it to the level of things like Parkinson's disease. So these kinds of belief, or the schemes that I'm talking about in terms of belief updating, are not sort of about propositional beliefs. They're about sort of subpersonal beliefs, Bayesian beliefs, mathematical beliefs that are represented at a very elemental level. So there are many ways that I could summarize the free energy principle. So I'm going to try and describe the free energy principle in a way I think that would be comfortably understood by somebody who is interested in psychology and cognitive science. And the basic idea is what we've already rehearsed, that the brain is a fantastic organ. It is literally a purveyor of fantasies, where these fantasies are hypotheses about what could have caused my sensations. So this is very much a 21st century view of the brain as a constructive organ, an embodied brain, an embodied organ that emphasizes the inside-out nature of perception, in contrast with a 20th century view of extracting as much information as you can from sensory streams, which would be a sort of outside-in perspective. So this 21st century view, in fact, is basically what people thought up until the 20th century. And by people, I mean people like Kant and Helmholtz, summarized, I think, in terms of the notion of predictive processing as active inference. And I use the word predictive processing, or the phrases predictive processing and active inference, as instances of a realization of the free energy principle deliberately, because it emphasizes both the predictive aspects and the active aspects. And that's certainly been a very big thing. So what's free energy? In this instance, probably best thought of in terms of prediction error. So what's a prediction error? Well, it's just the difference between what you're actually sensing and what you predicted you would sense if your hypothesis was right. So if you've got exactly the right explanation for what's going on out there beyond your sensory veil or outside of your skull, then your predictions should match perfectly the sensations that are coming in, and the prediction error, the mismatch, the difference will be very, very small, and you have effectively minimized your prediction error or minimized your free energy. That doesn't just work as an explanation for perception, all the machinations and the message passing and the distributed neuronal processing in the brain, literally changing your mind in order to furnish a better prediction that explains away or resolves that prediction error. It also provides a very nice metaphor for action, in the sense that you can also predict where you will feel your muscles in the next few 100 milliseconds or second. And those predictions now constitute descending fixed points or equilibrium points that can be used by classical reflex arcs to actually cause the movement to occur. So your predictions actually prescribe your bodily movements. And exactly the same mechanics can be brought to bear to understand autonomic reflexes, setting those homeostatic set points by these subpersonal predictions at certain points in your model of the world that is generating these predictions. So I said something quite important there. In order to have a free energy, or more strictly speaking, in order to minimize the prediction error, to minimize the free energy, you have to have a model that generates the predictions, which means you need a generative model. And that's what we think the brain is. So the brain is just a physical realization that entails a generative model of how your world works, and then it generates hierarchically predictions that are in the service of being offered to sensory input to evaluate the quality of those predictions in the form of a prediction error that then is used to drive and revise your beliefs and changing your activity. And this is the metaphor then for recurrent distributed neural processing in the brain, this recurrent exchange of descending predictions and ascending prediction errors, where ascending and descending here basically refers to message passing in cortical and subcortical hierarchies. So deep in the hierarchies with these abstract, deeply informed hypotheses, representations, narratives, beliefs about what I am doing or what I am or what's happening out there, they are cascaded down to the sensory level of these hierarchies, to the sensory cortex, and at the same time they are returned, or they evoke prediction errors that are reciprocated with ascending messages from the sensory surface of these hierarchies. Think of this like an onion, if you like, from the outside in. Are these ascending prediction errors that ascend to the deepest aspects of our brain and our belief building, sense making organ. So this view really can be, I think, succinctly captured by the notion that in making sense of the world, we want the newsworthy information. What's the newsworthy information? Well, it's the stuff we haven't predicted. It's the stuff we didn't know. It's the stuff, for example, that we would go and forage when we listen to a news channel or look at social media to see what happened with that football match or that particular disaster or that particular election. So we like those things we can't predict. So the prediction errors are good because they tell us how to change our mind. But it comes with a certain problem. So very much like social media, you have to now select which prediction errors to listen to, because they could be fake news or it could be very valid news. So in the same way that you choose the right kind of TV channel in which you place that kind of epistemic trust, your brain has to, millisecond by millisecond, decide what to attend to and what not to attend to in order to suppress those prediction errors that do not convey very precise information and to enable those precise prediction errors to gain access to high levels of the hierarchy to build a deep and informed and hierarchical explanation for what's going on at the moment. So this notion of only allowing through precise prediction errors is absolutely crucial. So we're now coming to the denouement of the story, which is the answer to your question, which is, why am I making so much of a thing about how the brain knows what is newsworthy? Which channels to tune into, which ones to afford that precision, that estimated predictability that ensures that you're attending to the right sources of information. This is basically attention. And also its complement, the attenuation when you need to ignore stuff. I introduced an example with Parkinson's disease before. That in order to move, we actually have to attenuate the consequences of our movement. So it's not just switching on or tuning into the right channel. You've also got to know when to ignore it and switch it off in order to actually act upon the world. So this is a very delicate game, and it goes beyond just inferring what's out there. Is this a face? If so, do I know this person? Which face is it? What's it trying to communicate? These are all the contents, our perceptual contents, that are, if you like, revised as we update our beliefs in response to these ascending prediction errors. That's the easy bit. The difficult bit is actually evaluating our uncertainty about those predictions. So in the same way that when you do, say, a t-test, it's easy to work out the difference in the mean of two groups of data. What is the difficult bit is to get the denominator of your t-statistic, which is a standard error, to work out your uncertainty about that. So this is where the precision estimator comes in. And if it's the case that the brain passes around these prediction errors in the service of doing the right kind of belief updating, then it must be only passing around and be sensitive to the precise prediction errors, which would look as if there are certain neuronal populations that are more sensitive to inputs and broadcast more powerfully than other ones. So now we've worked our way back to the important role of neuromodulation in terms of synaptic message passing. And now you can see that if we are compelled to supply predictions of the precision to attend to attenuate in order to make sense of the world, then we must be equipped with mechanisms that can implement that precision weighting. And that is likely to be basically reflected in the postsynaptic gain of certain populations reporting prediction errors, often thought to be superficial pyramidal cells. These are cells that lie in the upper layers of the cortex, and layers 1, 2, and 3. And thereby you can see how vitally important it is to get that gain control right. And it is that gain control which is exactly the site of action of all your favorite neuromodulators like dopamine. It is the thing that fast spiking inhibitory interneurons control in terms of their exchanges with these populations of cells that are reporting these prediction errors. So now you've got a picture of the brain as a fantastic organ that is coordinating its belief updating through a predictive coding-like mechanism, where it's nuancing that by switching on and off the precision at the right point in time of various sources of prediction error. Now ask yourself, what would happen if you lost the ability to do that neuromodulatory synaptic gain control? What could happen is that you are unable to attenuate the prediction errors from everything. What would that look like? Well, it would look like an inability to attend away from anything, and it would look like everything is surprising. It would mean I would never be able to engage my deeper constructs, my prior beliefs, what I had learned about the world, the kinds of representations and narratives and explanations that live at the higher level, the deeper levels of this hierarchy. So it would look as if I'm the kind of person who is preoccupied with the sensorium, who finds nothing surprising, but has a detailed but very low level attention to and representation of sensory input. And the picture I'm trying to paint here is of somebody who has severe autism, that is unable to attend away and finds any disruptions to regular, predictable sensory events very disturbing, because they have no explanations for them. So they will engage in behaviors that either maintain a continuity of sensory input, or indeed generate them that predictable input themselves through self-stimulation or self-stimming. Imagine that deficit of a failure to attenuate the precision of your sensory prediction errors occurred in later life due to some epigenetically pre-programmed change in the function of certain units of key neurotransmitter receptors, say in adolescence. So this would be like having adult autism, where suddenly you're unable to attenuate or to ignore certain kinds of sensory information. That would leave you in a situation where you were unable to have illusions, you were unable to show any surprising responses, because everything is interesting, because everything is surprising, because you can't ignore anything. And then you start to see the phenotype that characterizes the schizophrenic trait, a failure of things like mismatched negativity, oddball responses, a paradoxical ability to avoid illusory phenomena, so that people who are not active, don't have the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, are actually much better than neurotypical people in terms of telling you how the world is. So they're much more resistant to illusions, simply because they're attending to the low-level unattenuated information from the sensory levels of the hierarchy. So what might you do if you're contended with a fantastic organ that you can't tune out of anything? So what you might do is to try to increase the volume of your deep constructs and your prior beliefs that live deeper in the hierarchy. So what would that mean? Well, it means now a commitment to particular explanations that are deliberately rendered less accountable to the prediction errors coming from the sensorium. And this, of course, is a description of delusions and hallucinations, constructions of reality that are deliberately divorced from the constraints of sensory input, simply because you can't attenuate or modulate, at least, the volume, the gain, the precision of those sensory inputs. So that now is a story which paints the positive symptoms of schizophrenia as a kind of compensation for an underlying primary deficit, which explains many of the soft neurological signs of schizophrenia, like impoverished movement, particularly in, say, slow pursuit. And just interestingly, coming back to that explanation of Parkinson's disease, if someone with Parkinson's disease has got a broken dopaminergic system that can't attend away from all the sensory proprioceptive evidence that they are not moving, they are rendered bradykinesic. So this is a pernicious form of psychomotor poverty, which is exactly one of the negative symptoms that Daniel, you listed at the beginning of your question, which comes along with the non-positive, non-florid episodes, the psychotic breaks, that can now possibly be seen as an attempt to compensate for this failure of sensory attenuation that is plaguing you in terms of making sense of everyday life. So almost you can regard this as a paradoxical lesion, one of these unusual situations where two lesions make a right, in the sense that, if you can commit to some delusions, at least you're in charge of making some sense of what's going on, and are able to overwrite the flood of information that you would otherwise be exposed to. So that's a very long-winded way of unpacking the kind of story that inherits from the free energy principle that accommodates false inference and different kinds of type 1, type 2, positive and negative states and traits of schizophrenia, but that has an account and a calculus that ranges from Bayesian belief updating, predictive processing, right through to the synaptopathies and the molecular biology of that belief updating.
I'm curious about, we've discussed a little bit about the pathology states, for instance, in schizophrenia, where there's this disconnect between the mental model and the sensory data coming in. And in that circumstance, you can override the sensory data. So, for instance, I could imagine my brother here's face is a crow, and I don't care how much data there is coming towards me that he doesn't look like a crow. I'm going to continue to believe it. But it's also true that people who have this disorder are better at taking in unattenuated data, and they can tune out illusions. I'm curious if there is an intermediate state in which someone could be better attuned at either finding patterns that others will miss, or that will give them a sort of creativity advantage in processing information by not being so susceptible to the sensorial data.
Yeah, another wonderful question there. So at least three trains of thought we could eagerly pursue. You can choose which one you want to. Before I do that, your example of your brother being a crow, that's actually very prescient. I don't know if you read this somewhere, but my very first patient was actually under a special order from the Home Office, having murdered her next door neighbour, unfortunately. And the reason that she murdered and knifed her next door neighbour was because her next door neighbour was in fact a crow. So this is a very real world example, which terrified me at first encounter. But these things happen, and people will have the conviction that certain objects in the sensorium are crows, and possibly even with malign intent, to the extent that they will attack them physically. So that example really does matter and has personal relevance for me. However, back to the more important sort of academic points you were making. I think it is absolutely the case that there's no right or wrong here. In fact, mathematically, there's something called the complete class theorem, which is where it makes it provably true that everything that exists, whether you're Van Gogh or whether you're in the midst of a psychotic break in a mental institution, everything that exists is Bayes optimal under some prior beliefs, which means having failing to attenuate, and deliberately perhaps through the ingestion of some psychedelic drugs, for recreational purposes, having the ability to really drill down and analyze and see those patterns and represent without, by dissolving any preconceptions and any prior constraints coming deep from or higher from the cortical hierarchy, can be an enlightening experience, and possibly a creative experience, and possibly an artistic experience. So, I'm thinking here of obvious examples like idiots savants, people with severe autism, that are able to produce the most beautiful and detailed visual representations of their experience in a way that would far transcend my capacity to reproduce those things, using visual art. Excuse me. You may also argue that most of creativity really does rest upon exploring different narratives, different ways of perceiving and looking at things, revisiting possibly hypotheses that no one has ever had before. In order to do that, of course, you have to relax your commitment to your preconceptions. And what does that mean neurochemically and in terms of predictive processing, for example? It simply means reducing the precision of these prior beliefs and the prediction errors that deep in the hierarchy maintain these ways of thinking and explaining your lived world. When they become pathological, this would be basically stuck in a rut. So you can go too far the other way in terms of assigning your lots of precision to your deeply held convictions deep in your generative models, even as a normal person. Key examples of this date back for decades, things like learned helplessness models of depression. You now have a particular self-model and a particular set of prior beliefs about the way you are going to respond to this, that it is very difficult to shake. You cannot get out of this rut simply because you can't explore other ways of doing it. So what do? You do some cognitive behaviour therapy. If you have an anxiety disorder, a phobia, for example, another example of a pathological, although it can never be Bayes, it cannot be not Bayes optimal, but what is deemed to be pathological prior belief about the consequences of being exposed to a bumblebee. One way of relaxing and dissolving those maladaptive prior beliefs, reducing their precision, is just to use flooding therapy or exposure therapy, for example. Or you could try certain drugs that have a neuromodulatory action that enable you to explore different ways and different hypotheses. So I think this notion, this key diathesis or key balance between the precision afforded sensory evidence and the precision afforded your accumulated knowledge and wisdom and prior beliefs and narratives about how that sensory evidence should unfold. Getting that balance right is absolutely crucial in health and in disease, and it may be exactly the right control of that balance that undergirds all creative thinking and all artistic endeavors. Just lateral thinking or seeing the world in a different way that allows somebody else to explore other hypotheses that entails a dissolution to a certain extent of the precision of your prior convictions.
I've heard you mentioned autism and schizophrenia sort of on a spectrum. I've definitely read that of other people arguing that there's some evolutionary trade-off between them. Autistic people are not very aware of other people's internal mental states classically, and schizophrenics sometimes are like almost incredibly aware of what's going on inside of, intuiting someone else's internal state just based on the flicker of their eyes. It reminds me of when I was on my psychiatry rotation, I was sitting next to the psychiatrist interviewing a paranoid schizophrenic, and he was looking at me, looking at him, and he accused me of having lying eyes. I'm not sure exactly what he was picking up on, but I'm sure there was something, and he was picking up on something. So how do you think about these two disorders, and do you view them as having some sort of evolutionary trade-off?
That is a very challenging question. Your story there just reminded me of another early experience when I was doing my first psychiatric training. The remarkable capacity of certain people with schizophrenia to come up with these really engaging sound bites, lying eyes. I mean, I've heard sad eyes before, but lying eyes, that's nice. I mean, that's the sort of thing you can imagine on an album cover, or the title of the next HBO miniseries. How did that person come up with that juxtaposition of concepts, which is exactly, I think, one of these creative other constructs, other hypotheses, other narratives, here a semantic narrative, just by putting two words together, that is the gift of actually being able to attend away from, or to attend to these deeply held convictions and alternative semantic hypotheses. The one that I remember most acutely from the first year of group therapy with schizophrenics was angel shit. I love that as a sort of phrase, because it's something you never come up with normally. It's like sort of smoky water something. So I've always wanted to write a book and call it Angel Shit, but I'm now too old, so I probably will never do that. But I think these are beautiful examples of being able to put the world back together again and in a different kind of way. So having told that story, I've completely forgotten what your question was. Oh yes, the evolutionary trade-off and the functional anatomy and of autism versus schizophrenia. I think that there is, I don't think it's a trade-off. I think that there is an evolutionary trade-off that underwrites both autism and schizophrenia. From a purely mechanistic point of view, talking about the Bayesian mechanics, but also the mechanics of neuromodulation. From a purely mechanistic point of view, I think that both autism and schizophrenia have the same explanation. This is basically a failure of attention attenuation as articulated in terms of assigning or affording the right kind of precision to various messages in the brain. But there is a trade-off, I think a deeper trade-off here, which comes back to Mitch's point that there is something good about having a slightly schizoid view of the world. It makes you creative, and it enables you to explore new hypotheses. All good scientists must have at some level a slightly either schizophrenic form, but certainly a hypomanic aspect to their way of thinking. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to create anything new. They wouldn't, they would just recapitulate what they've learned from their parents and their teachers and mentors and loved and admired ones. So, I think that is manifest in the sense that things like schizophrenia and manic depressive psychosis are still with us as well-defined phenotypic traits. So they must be subject to positive evolutionary selective pressure, which means there must be something good about them, else we wouldn't have them at the moment. So I do think there's a trade-off between, again, this balance of, assigning too much precision to the sensorium versus those beliefs that we've accumulated during neurodevelopment and subsequent experience-dependent plasticity. But it's a very fine balance, and that finesse or fineness, rather, of balance, can have can give you a sort of a vigor from an evolutionary point of view in excursions of either way. So you can get very rigid people who, in certain roles, that's exactly what you want, an obsessional compulsive attitude to good bookkeeping, due process, protocols, procedures done definitively in exactly the right kind of way. You're going to, I'm sure you're already doing that, in the operating theatre or everywhere else in terms of just a sort of mental state examination or a clinical examination. But on the other hand, you need to be inventive when it comes to differential diagnoses or in other parts of your life. So you need that kind of latitude, and it may well be that the price that people with schizophrenia might be paying is basically the price of this very functional attitude that is endowed at an evolutionary timescale.
I have a question that I guess relates to, let's take a patient who has symptoms of depression. So they have, in your model, a high degree of certainty that the future events that will happen to them are going to be negative sensory experiences. And you could theoretically break the relationship between that predictive model and the sensory experience of the world with various forms of pharmacology or other types of cognitive behavioral therapy. One sort of self-help genre that I've heard outside of the context of medical school is visualization. Like, there are all sorts of self-help gurus, like if you're familiar with Tony Robbins, who's a sort of personal development entrepreneur who uses lots of imagination and rehearsing of goals vividly. So an example of this would be, take a normal non-pathophysiologic state. So somebody who wants to improve their health, they will imagine themselves vividly as being very muscular and going to the gym or what have you, in order to create a mental framework of themselves as having those traits in order to coax their daily actions into reaching that defined goal. I'm curious, just as a psychological tool, if this would relate to, is this the way that I should be thinking about a potential application of the free energy principle in psychotherapy?
Yes, I think you can, and I have colleagues who have done exactly that. I'm thinking of Alistair Dobbins in the United Kingdom, and who has applied this style of thinking in sports medicine and sports psychology, but also in the context of people who get locked into certain behaviours which they find very distressing. It is also this notion of rehearsing internal narratives. It may not just be a therapeutic device or one aspect of a therapeutic repertoire, but it may be actually absolutely essential for normal functioning and keeping your house in order in terms of your brain as a good statistical organ. And I'm referring here, of course, to the most important sort of mental rehearsals that we all engage in, which is dreaming. So, there are people, and in particular Alan Hobson, who's one of my most senior friends and colleagues, who believes that sleep and dreaming has not only the answer to consciousness, but to existence per se. And it is the most beautiful example of the brain as a constructive organ, as something that can actually generate its own enacted experiences. So, and then the challenge comes, to understand that from the point of view of the free energy principle. Why would you do that? Just as an aside, the mathematical argument rests upon what I hinted at, which is the notion of housekeeping. So, good generative models, good brains, good ways of explaining your sensory exchanges with the world are those which minimize free energy in the sense that we've discussed in terms of prediction errors. Mathematically, they can also be articulated in another way of describing free energy, which is model evidence. Technically, if you're a statistician, it's called marginal likelihood, but let's stick with evidence. And evidence, and so you can either say that the brain is in the game of minimizing prediction error, or it's in the game of maximizing evidence. And the kind of evidence that people mean in this rendering, and in philosophy, it's sometimes described as self-evidencing. This is Jacob Haue's philosophical notion of active inference and predictive processing, or active inference in the service of maximizing the evidence for you as a model of the world, or your brain as a generative model of your lived world. What does that mean? Well, just like the scientist or the statistician in you, the evidence decomposes into accuracy and complexity. So by maximizing the evidence for your hypothesis or your model, your explanation for your lived world, you are implicitly trying to provide an accurate account for what's going on in the minimally complex way possible. So this is Occam's principle, very closely related to James's maximum entropy principle. So there are fundamental pressures on self-evidencing to keep things simple. So the idea that dreaming and mental rehearsal, one idea is that if you do it a sufficient number of times, you become fluent in the way that you do it in the simplest way possible. And you reduce the complexity in the absence of worrying about the accuracy, because there's no data to account for, because you're either asleep or you're doing it in your head with your eyes closed. So you can really drill down and focus on the complexity issue and maximize the efficiency. And indeed, there are, in theoretical neurobiology, understood and articulated principles of maximum efficiency and minimum redundancy, the Infmax principle, that applies throughout the brain at different levels of analysis. I think all that we need to know here is that imagination, internal simulation, and rehearsal in the absence of some explicit sensory input are all fundamental mechanisms by which you can minimize the complexity and maximize the efficiency of generating predictions. But in this instance, predictions about what I am doing. So that's really quite important, because the other side of the answer to your question, how would one cast this in the context of the free energy principle, speaks to the importance of the generative model in supplying hypotheses about what we are going to do. Just to put that very, very simply, we may be very special kinds of creatures whose brains are equipped with generative models that generate predictions of the consequences of action, unlike, say, a virus or a thermostat, that we actually have in our generative models the notion that me as agent will cause this to happen if I do that. And that means I've got the opportunity now to internally rehearse what would happen if I did this, what would happen if I did that. Even more simply, this is just the ability to plan. So the very fact that we can plan necessarily implies that possibly 99% of our inference is all about working out what am I most likely to be doing at the moment. What's the best explanation for my behavior? What's the best narrative? What kind of person am I? What would happen if I did that? And of course, building those counterfactual plans that have this sort of temporal or counterfactual depth relies upon internal simulations and rehearsals. And if you can do that and carve up a nice simple space of activities, then through this notion of action, providing evidence for your models of the world and basically fulfilling top-down predictions, you can see that, if I go through something in my head and I become expert and fluent and efficient in that, then it's a very small step to actually realize those plans and actually be much more proficient in, say, playing tennis or regaining my fluency in golf. Or in a more therapeutic context, leaving the house if I had agoraphobia, trying to palm that bee, which used to terrify me. So just by rehearsing me doing things, if you like, refines and carves out particular narratives which are of a special sort in the sense that they are narratives about my enacted engagement with the world. And if I have those hypotheses and plans at hand, they can be called upon much more readily to provide an explanation for my ongoing active engagement and behavior. So I think there's great mileage in thinking of the utility of mental rehearsal in terms of planning, and possibly even putting this kind of, the variants that would appear in certain forms of cognitive behavioral therapy, for example. Although I have to say that some people in this field don't like CBT, because it doesn't celebrate the imaginal and the self-actuating aspect of some of these therapeutic approaches. But you can imagine having drug-assisted psychotherapy along these lines, that you're at the same time that you're taking, say, certain psychomimetics to relax those high-level priors, at the same time, just slip in a new way of behaving, a way that doesn't involve repeated checking behaviors if you've got obsessive compulsive disorder, a way of reconceiving your chronic pain. So, many models of chronic pain rest upon a particular interpretation of your interoceptive feelings. And I think that, bringing into the conversation interoception is important if you want to talk about depression and feelings and emotions, because, much of these words are, from the point of view of active inference, these are hypotheses that best explain the portfolio and the myriad of sensations I have to explain. And it may well be that the vast majority of these sensations are actually from my body. They're literally gut feelings, and I have to explain them. And I could explain this particular set of sensations that are telling me that I've got a particular blood pressure, that I'm a state of cardiac acceleration. Perhaps the best explanation for this is that I'm anxious. And if I'm anxious, that requires a certain deployment of precisions in terms of things I'm likely to do. I'm likely to either run away or be on my guard, or a whole set of different plans and hypotheses presents itself because I am anxious. But I have inferred I am anxious on the basis of gut feelings, because part of the plans that my anxiety entails in terms of providing predictions would be cardiac acceleration. So you have a beautiful feedback, a vicious cycle, which can also be very virtuous, where you've dissolved sort of a Jamesian Lang-like construction of emotions, where you are both generating the interoceptive evidence for your hypothesis that I am in this emotional state. I bring that in, of course, because the same kinds of arguments can also apply to nociception, as an example of interoception. So, the example of chronic pain could simply be that the best hypothesis for all these sensations, the very fact that I take painkillers, that I have to be very careful about the way I move and my posture, and that I am in chronic pain, is that I am a sufferer of chronic pain, and that I am suffering. And this is the best explanation. And to make sure that is the best explanation, I will attend to all of those signals that supply the right kind of evidence that, yes, this is the right explanation for my state of being. So now you're seeing chronic pain as a self-maintaining pathology of attention. Again, we come back to the neuromodulation, the gating of nociception, which is, of course, not a million miles away from very early Wall-esque gate theories of pain, which rely upon sort of the excitability of certain pain pathways. But here now cast from the point of view of active inference, but specifically about interoception, as interoceptive inference. Again, stuck in a rut. I am someone who suffers from chronic pain. This is the way I hold my body. This is what I attend to. These are the things I have to do, because if I don't, I'm going to make this chronic pain worse. Yes, I am still in chronic pain. I'm just attending to that. Even little paresthesia due to hyperventilation or tummy rumblings due to sort of, peristalsis could now falsely be inferred as evidence that I'm in pain. So, unlike you and me, if I want to distract myself and reset my attenuation mechanisms, my precision mechanisms, I'll rub my tummy to supply other sources of extraceptive somatosensory information that realign my precision allocation, and I can attend away from my nociceptive input and actually explore another hypothesis. Oh, I'm not in pain. That was just, a little twinge after eating too much. So I think this notion of allowing people to rehearse different narratives about their embodied engagement, not only with the outside world, but also with their own bodies, plays a really useful role in different kinds of explain to oneself and also to the patient why it is that they become engaged in this kind of self-modeling, and what the perpetual maintaining factors are that are perfectly Bayes optimal, but can be you can get stuck in a rut.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Friston. This has been a real pleasure. If people want to learn more about you or your work, how can they find you on the internet other than just Googling your name?
Oh, I was going to say you can just Google my name. I'm trying to be recluse, so I think Google my name and see what happens. That's the best plan. It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you very much indeed.
If you'd like to support us, here are some ways you can help. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, preferably a phenomenal review. Visit us at externalmedicinepodcast.com and tell your friends.